Berry is an interesting character. While she's like a DOT character, most of her damage doesn't really come from her DOT. But yeah, in this video, I'll explain how she works, how to use her, show you some testing on the 5-star weapon, and of course, whether or not she's worth pulling. So Berry is actually quite difficult to understand. She's quite confusing actually, but the way you play her, the way you use her, the way you execute her skills, whatever, is actually very simple. So in a nutshell, how you use her, you just get the A0 to 3 stacks, which is the Chain of Love, the 3 stacks. You do that from the highlight and skill 1, and then you apply Lovesick stack, which is the DOT, you get to 10 stacks, then you spam skill 3. That's about it. Very simple to use. But to understand everything, it's actually not easy. Then there's also this table thing that tells you what applies, like what works for what. It's a little confusing. Let's start with A0. The first time she activates skill 1, you gain Chains of Love. Then you also get another stack for every highlight you use. So you need to use 1 skill 1 and 2 highlights to get 3 stacks. And you definitely want to get 3 stacks, because for each stack, you get some sort of buff. The first stack, you get a damage taken increased by 4% for each Lovesick stack, so up to 40%. This was buffed from, the other servers. Previously it was only 2.5. Second stack is a very, I think arguably the most important one maybe, because it increases crit rate by 15%. Very good, obviously. But this is important. All her skill damage is counted as continuous damage. So this is very important, because now the DOT item from Summer Marion actually buffs all her skills. Her skill 1, skill 2, skill 3, everything is counted as continuous damage. This is very important, which means that the third stack actually buffs all the skills, because all the skills are continuous damage. So that's very important. So skill 1 is a single target move. It has a 1 turn cooldown. Then it inflict 2 Lovesick stacks. So Lovesick stack is the DOT stack. So Berry has 2 stacks, okay? Chains of Love, which is the one for A0, and then the DOT stack, which is required for like a bunch of things. We will talk about it later. But yeah, skill 1 gives you 2 stacks of Lovesick. Then when the target has more than 70% HP, she will do more damage. And then she can chain the skill also every time she kills with a skill 1. This is actually quite useful, because if you can chain, that means you can immediately apply a bunch of Lovesick stack on like the first turn, for example. Skill 2, single target, it gives you 4 Lovesick stacks. The skill 2 can be useful if you require the extra stack. Skill 3, the biggest damage comes from skill 3, even more than the highlight, despite the highlight being higher like skill multiplier. So skill 3 is a single target move, and it scales on like the number of stacks of Lovesick you have. So this is 1.7 times 10, so it's 117%. Then if you have 10 or more Lovesick stack, you increase even more attack. So this goes up to like what, almost 500% skill multiplier, which is interesting because that's only slightly better than this. Not taking into account this part of the description. Another important part of a skill tree is that it resets the duration of Lovesick stack. So basically, once you have 10 Lovesick stack, you keep spamming skill 3, the enemies will forever have the Lovesick stack because it keeps resetting. On highlight, does good damage, not better than skill 3, but it's still decent damage. And then it allows Lovesick to crit for 3 turns. So this part is interesting because Lovesick stack is like a DOT thing, so that means it doesn't really, like, it's either it crits or it doesn't crit. It's not like stable domain, like Guild Boss as well as a stable domain, right? You don't actually like miss the crit. For the DOT stacks, you can miss the crit. If you're like 90% crit, there's 10% chance you don't actually crit and you don't actually get the extra damage. So you actually really need 100% crit rate for Berry, because you can miss the crit with the DOT. Though to be fair, like I said, the highlight also doesn't do as much damage as skill 3. Still decent, but it's a bit lower than expected. And the reason is because this part of the skill doesn't crit. The Lovesick stack crits, this 457% does not crit. That's how highlight works. Most highlights doesn't crit unless it says that it does. So that's very unfortunate. That's why it's worse, even though it has like higher skill multiplier. Higher because you do a continuous effect damage thing 1 time and 2 times from Lovesick. So this first part, continuous damage, includes your burn, your curse, all that stuff. Even I'm pretty sure your Vasuki DOT also counts to this continuous damage effect. And then Lovesick obviously also counts it. So that means Lovesick is like 180% or something. It doesn't say here, but what is it? It's like 180% for 10 stacks. So 180 times 3, that's 540 plus 457. That's almost 1000% attack, and it still does worse than skill 3. I think it's, like I said, it's likely because of this one, because it cannot crit. Yeah, passive. For each Chains of Love stack, which is the A0 stack, you get 15% attack, so this goes up to 45% because of 3 stacks. Then second passive is increase continuous damage by 15%. I believe this one is like final damage or something like that. At least according to Lovesick.net. I don't know how to test this, so we just have to take their word. So let's talk about awareness. So we're going to talk about weapon a bit later. So for each Lovesick stack, increase defense, decrease defense by 3%. So this can go to 30%. And then you also gain extra Lovesick stack every time you skill. This means that the rotation actually changes a little bit. Because you gain Lovesick stacks quicker, you don't really need to use 2 skill 2s anymore to get the stack. Then A2, the start battle, you gain 1 Chains of Love, and now it's stacked up to 5 times. And then at 4 stacks, now it gives you crit damage. 5 stacks, it gives you like an endure thing. I haven't really tested this one, how this one works. But basically, from reading this, it means that you survive 1 HP, and then you gain 4 stacks of power love. And then every time an ally moves, after their move, you will do damage. Up to 4 times. Then Barry will die. A4, you get like 30% attack after using highlight, and it permanently increases. 30% attack is not really much, it's just okay. A6 is pretty good because now Lovesick stack lasts stacks up to 15 times, which means that your skill 3 also does more damage because it stacks on your based on the Lovesick stack, right? The highlight will also obviously do more damage because it activates your Lovesick stack. So the more Lovesick stack you have, the more damage you do. And obviously the boss's action also, after that take action, they'll do DOT to themselves. So that's not really a lot. That's usually like 300,000 damage. Not a lot compared to like 4 or 5 million from skill 3. But yeah, now basically to summarize this, for the first time you use skill 1, skill 2, skill 3 highlight, they do another hit, which is pretty good, especially for like a shorter fight. Now I want to talk about this table thing, which gets very interesting and confusing. I don't know why they made like this, but basically, yeah, the skill 1, skill 2, skill 3 works like any other skill. They take into account attack damage multiplier, crit rate, crit multiplier, defense debuff, pierce, everything. But Lovesick stack works differently. Lovesick stack application is when you apply the Lovesick stack, either by the skill 1, skill 2 or skill 3. Skill 1 can give you Lovesick, skill 4 can give you Lovesick, but skill 3 resets it. Resetting also counts as reapplying or refresh here. The DOT Lovesick stack, not DOT, Lovesick, I want to be very clear because there's a DOT thing here, very clear. Lovesick stack is a DOT, but DOT is like a general term, right? And to be specific, Lovesick stack is Barry's own stack. So that's where things can get a bit confusing. Continuous damage, DOT, Lovesick, all that stuff, confusing. Spurn is curse, Basuki, DOT, whatever. But Lovesick stack is Barry's own DOT. It scales on attack, defense debuff. It does not scale on pierce. So pierce actually is useless for DOT. Not DOT, Lovesick. See, I made a mistake there. Then when you activate Lovesick from the highlight, and turn N is when the opponents move, then they take another tick. This tool does get the crit rate, crit multiplier. From my knowledge, I think is from like actually taking the damage. So one is application, one is activation. Okay, I think. And let me just put a rotation to explain this because it can get a bit confusing. Okay, here's a rotation. This is the rotation that I use. Yeah, this is the rotation that I used for the last video, the Guild Wars video. What it means is that, let's say a highlight here, we use a code highlight here. The highlight here, the Lovesick activation, this one, right? This one will be based on this skill 3, the stats of Barry on this action. Which means that you see I use a Genostic Tarukaja, right? This Tarukaja doesn't get applied to the highlight here because it was after I apply or reset the Lovesick stacks. So that's what it means. Activation is when you use a highlight or when the boss takes action. Apply is when you actually use Barry skill 3 to reset the Lovesick stacks. That's the difference. And it sounds complicated, but you honestly don't really need to care too much about this. Like, it doesn't pierce, yes, and you have to apply during like your application. Sometimes have less buff, yes, but truth is the highlight also doesn't, like I said, it doesn't do as much damage as skill 3. So you can kinda ignore this a little bit. Personally, I kinda just ignore it. I don't really optimize the highlight damage that much because it's not as good as a skill 3. Skill 3, like shown here, it's literally double damage here. But the highlight here did do pretty good damage. That's mainly because it has more buffs now. The Tarukaja buff, we apply here, right? Tarukaja buff now, you have Marion highlight buff. That's why it has higher highlight damage. But you can see that the last skill 3 here also lower damage than the skill 3. And then you use skill 3 like 4 times. So you can kinda ignore, I wouldn't say ignore completely, but you can kinda ignore it, prioritize skill 3 a bit more. And the pierce, well, I would prefer, I would still prefer like defense debuff. Obviously, you can see that my rotation, which I showed, has no Dionysus because I focus everything on defense debuff. And ideally, you also don't want to run like Turbo or even Twins because they are Pierce. You still want Pierce stats on Barry, but teammates, you try not to use Pierce characters, if that makes sense. Now what about this DOT activation? This thing is basically you'll burn your curse. So that's why you don't want to confuse DOT and Lovesick. They are kind of different thing. DOT is your burn your curse. They don't scale on stacks because they scale on the max HP or opponents. The highlight base is basically the 457% here. Like I said, it does not crit, as you can see here, but it applies, takes into account attack, defense, pierce. And finally, the last thing, this part. DOT damage increase is calculated in a separate bucket. I have no idea if it's actually true, but I'll just take Luffy.net's word for it. So to use very, very, very simple, I also already showed in the last video, and I'll tell you that the execution, the way you use her is actually very simple, despite the confusing, complicated kit, the DOT, whatever, continuous damage, whatever thing. Simple to set up. You just set up, make sure you have 10 Lovesick stack, 3 chains on Love stack, then you spam skill 3, that's all. Then I just showed you the AC rotation. This one I also showed last video already. This rotation I think you can use somewhat honestly, because the fact that it's only like 15% better than my A2 borrow, I feel like it should be better, maybe. If anyone knows a way to improve this, feel free to let me know. Or maybe the highlight just sucks. 2.6, 2.7 I guess. Maybe that's why. But yeah, the rotation is very different because of you can do 2 berry highlights now with the A6. Without A6, you cannot do the last one. Then I also did the cord and twins rotation here. Feel free to use it, I guess. It's with A6 cord, so you need A6 cord to follow this. But you see that it's only slightly worse than the Marion team. So twins still got it, even though it is for A1 compared to A0 or Marion. And now let's talk about 5-star weapon. The 5-star weapon is interesting. So the 4-star increases attack, then you buff the damage after using highlight for 2 turns. 5-star weapon increases crit rate. This is the highest so far of any weapon, highest crit rate. And then when you have 3 stacks of Chains of Love, you buff 34% damage, and then your skill 3 does 32.8% more crit damage. This is pretty good, but again, like a lot of weapons, buffs crit rate. My argument is often if you can max crit rate, the weapon loses value. Not as good. Is it also true for Berry? It is not. Somehow, for some reason, I don't know why, this weapon is stronger. Even though you hit the crit, you can see that this is 25%, but DOD, Devour Dreams usually want to take the results with a grain of salt, because DOD plays very differently compared to SOS, so I will just take the SOS results better. You can see that crit cap 17.5, that's really high actually. Very, very high. Summer Puppet, crit cap was about 12-13%. This was 17, which is very, very strange, confuses me also, because Berry's weapon is actually similar strength as Puppet's weapon when you compare them, like on paper. 36.3% crit damage, slightly better than Berry. Crit rate, you can just completely ignore because it's just assuming crit cap anyways, right? Then you have the damage thing. 1 to 5 times that is what? 34% damage. Berry also 34%, so the strength is literally the same. I mean, Puppet buffs slightly more crit damage even. So I don't understand, actually, how is better. And thankfully, Global gave Berry this buff, if not it's going to be worse. But yeah, the only reason I can think of is maybe this crit rate only applies to Resonance. So when you use the skill 1, she does less damage. So that's why the weapon sucks more, maybe. Because the skill 1 doesn't really crit cap. It's only the skill 2 and Resonance from Puppet. That's the only logical reason I can think of. This weapon I actually recommend getting, despite you reaching crit cap. So finally, should you pull Berry? Honestly, it depends on your needs. The last assassin is Kasumi, I would recommend actually. Because freaking Berry A0 did 700 million damage or score on the guild boss. Meanwhile, A6 R6 Kasumi with the same team did 1.1 billion. That's crazy. She is very, very good. Very strong assassin. Weapon I also recommend it. Like I already showed. Very, very good weapon even if you crit cap already. And yeah, just pull if you want, honestly. Or you want to save for like future assassins, feel free to do that also. But DPS usually again lower value because they can easily be power crept by another DPS.